In the vast and enigmatic universe of human existence, death stands as a final curtain, inevitable and mysterious. Among the multiple paths that lead to this threshold, some are particularly brutal, forcing the body into unimaginable agony before yielding. Such is the case of death by cyanide poisoning, a dissolution that not only snatches life, but tears it from its molecular foundations, in a process as terrifying as it is relentless. It is catalogued as relatively fast, yes, but speed does not mitigate the cruelty of its mechanism. It is an internal annihilation, a suffocation that occurs from the tiniest cell, extending like a cold shadow until completely consuming the organism. The virulence of this poison, its destructive capacity, fluctuates significantly, depending on two crucial factors: the administered dose and the chemical form in which it presents itself. Cyanide can manifest as salts, such as sodium or potassium cyanide, or in its gaseous form, the lethal hydrogen cyanide. A small amount, a mere gram of potassium cyanide, is enough to annihilate an adult's life in a matter of minutes. However, the agony can be prolonged if the intake is smaller, stretching the torture for hours, a torment that is etched into the memory of those who witness it. The effects, however, converge into the same horrifying fatality. Cyanide, with deadly precision, adheres to the cytochrome C oxidase enzyme, a vital component in the electron transport chain within mitochondria, the energy powerhouses of our cells. By blocking this enzyme, it prevents oxygen from being used by tissues, creating a macabre paradox. The body is flooded with oxygen, but its cells cannot breathe. It is suffocation at a subcellular level, a chemical kidnapping of life itself. This molecular inhibition unleashes a cascade of systemic failures. Internal organs, dependent on a constant supply of aerobic energy, begin to silently collapse. The heart, the brain, the lungs, the liver, all succumb to this oxygen deprivation. Simultaneously, the muscles, deprived of their energy source, rebel with uncontrollable spasms, while the central nervous system, the epicenter of consciousness and control, disintegrates. Symptoms manifest with increasing brutality. The intoxicated individual is assaulted by dizziness of a dizzying intensity, where the world spins out of control and the earth refuses to remain firm under their feet. Muscle pains follow, piercing every fiber of the body, a dreadful agony that twists the limbs and arches the back. Then convulsions ensue, uncontrolled electrical discharges that shake the body, a macabre dance that precedes darkness. Consciousness vanishes into a dense fog, dragging all perception with it, until the final and absolute silence of death claims its victory. But even in that fall into the abyss, phenomena that defy comprehension manifest, disturbing the threshold between life and end. It is reported that those who die from cyanide poisoning, in their last moments, seem to cry. It is not a cry of sadness or emotional anguish, but a physiological expression, a macabre echo of molecular damage. Muscle spasms, oxygen deprivation, affecting facial nerves and vocal cords, can cause involuntary muscle contraction, forcing the tear ducts and producing guttural sounds resembling a sob. It is a final, inarticulate lament, an involuntary tribute to the barbarity of the poison, an image that haunts those who witness it, a chilling reminder of the way cyanide dehumanizes departure. The calendar marked the 10th of February 1979, a summer Saturday in vibrant Buenos Aires. The afternoon sun filtered through the awnings and balconies of Mexico Street in the historic and peaceful neighborhood of Montserrat. The air was warm, dense, laden with the city's aromas. The sweetness of confectionaries, the distant smoke of some barbecue, the faint perfume of jasmine in the interior patios. Nilda Adelina Gamba, an Argentine woman who had already crossed the 60-year mark, lived in a small apartment at number 1177 on this same street. Her life, apparently, was that of a common person, marked by the quiet routine of solitude. Although sheltered by the proximity of some relatives who resided in the same building, a comforting presence in the vastness of the big city. That Saturday, Nilda's afternoon had been imbued with joy and camaraderie. The apartment, usually silent, had filled with the murmur of friendly voices. She had received a visit from a dear friend, and together they had shared the afternoon tea ritual. The delicate sound of porcelain cups clinking, the comforting aroma of freshly served black tea, mingled with the exquisite perfume of petite four pastries. These small delights, jewels of Argentine confectionery, small sweet snacks, fine pastry desserts, were the perfect complement for a lively and pleasant conversation. The soft laughter of the two women floated in the warm air as the sun slowly declined, coloring the living room walls with golden and orange tones. The happiness of that encounter extended well into the afternoon, until the moment when the friend, with a promise of future meetings, said goodbye and left, leaving Nilda once again in the tranquility of her home, with the sweetness of the pastries and the warmth of friendship still in the air. But the peaceful return to quietness was broken with unheard-of ferocity. Just a short while after her friend's departure, Nilda was assaulted by a whirlwind of pain. The first onslaught was a wave of dizziness so intense that the ground under her feet seemed to give way, preventing her from standing upright. The room began to spin, objects danced in her peripheral vision, and a cold sweat beaded on her forehead. Then, a strange, incomprehensible sensation of shortness of breath invaded her. A suffocating oppression that was not relieved despite her desperate gasps. The air, though present, did not reach her lungs, did not nourish her cells. Next, the pain. A dreadful, lacerating pain that spread through every corner of her body, affecting her muscles with methodical cruelty. Her arms, her legs, her torso, all began to experience uncontrollable spasms. Her limbs twisted in strange contortions, a kind of macabre dance that arched and bent her against her will. It was a torment that tore screams from her, a pain that went beyond the physical, a chemical invasion of her very existence. Poor Nilda, with a clinical history of diabetic attacks and health already compromised by years and various ailments, was a vulnerable woman. Her fragility, however, became a tragic smokescreen. Her desperate screams quickly alerted the neighbors. Concerned, they went to her apartment and found her in a state of indescribable agitation and pain, contorting on the floor. Immediately, the doctor who had attended her for so long, a professional familiar with her ailments, was called. Upon his arrival, with urgency marked on his face and in his movements, the doctor proceeded to an initial examination. He palpated her abdomen, perceived rigidity and pain, and his first conclusion was poisoning. However, at that critical moment, Nilda's condition, though painful, did not seem terminal to him. It seemed like common food poisoning, perhaps from something poorly cooked or spoiled, a comprehensible assumption given the circumstances and the patient's history. The urgency of the situation, the chaos of the emergency, clouded his perception, and so, he dismissed a crucial detail, a loose thread that could have unraveled the truth: the peculiar smell emanating from Nilda's breath. A subtle, almost pleasant aroma, reminiscent of marzipan or bitter almonds. Curious, yes, but not alarming enough at that moment, as the woman's symptoms had slightly diminished, giving her a brief respite. The discomfort, momentarily attenuated, contributed to diverting the doctor's attention from the true nature of the poison. Nilda, lying down and exhausted, was now accompanied by her neighbor and, to some extent, relative, Mrs. Murano. In the twilight that filtered through the windows, the doctor dictated a prescription with instructions and suggestions for the treatment of what he believed to be common poisoning. With the urgency of the case, the building doorman, a diligent young man who opened and closed doors, was sent in a hurry to the pharmacy. Mrs. Murano, with a mixture of solicitous concern and apparent unwavering devotion, offered to stay and care for the sick woman. They were lifelong friends, united by deep affection, by countless tea afternoons, by shared interests and, as was whispered, by some degree of distant kinship, perhaps co-sisters-in-law. Her offer was received with gratitude, a blessing in those moments of uncertainty. The presence of someone trustworthy was imperative in case of any eventuality. Nilda, slowly regaining the ability to breathe with less difficulty, looked at her friend with gratitude in her eyes. A faint glow of appreciation illuminated her face. What are friends for, if not for times of need, for when one requires a shoulder to lean on? The scene seemed a picture of loyalty and mutual support. The doctor, with a clear conscience and the conviction of having acted correctly, withdrew, leaving the two women alone. Shortly after, the doorman returned with the medicines. Mrs. Murano, with a grateful smile, took the provisions and dismissed the young man, who left, leaving the apartment plunged into an unsettling quietness. Murano proceeded to prepare the medicine, under the dim light that the incipient night already offered. However, the silence of the night would not last long. As darkness fell, a desperate call again alerted the doctor. It was Mrs. Murano's voice, now tinged with panic, reporting that her friend had drastically worsened, that she was not responding, that her absence was total. The doctor, after requesting some additional data, confirmed what he feared. Nilda had entered a deep coma. Without hesitation, he took his car and drove at full speed towards the apartment, his mind already anticipating the worst. Upon arrival, the scene was desolate. Nilda Adelina Gamba had left this world. The body, still retaining a faint residual warmth, lay inert, as if sleeping a deep and unbreakable sleep. But the absence of vital signs was undeniable. Life had been extinguished. Her friend, her relative, Mrs. Murano, whose first name was Giya, was there, by the bed, a picture of desolation and pain. Her reddened eyes sought an answer on the doctor's face. She asked, with a broken voice, the cause of such a sudden and tragic loss. The doctor, trying to find a plausible explanation, considered several factors: Nilda's age, her history of chronic diseases, especially diabetes. He concluded that food poisoning, perhaps from a spoiled piece of chicken or some poorly preserved food in the refrigerator, had been the trigger. Her body, already weakened by diabetes and other pre-existing ailments, had not been able to resist the onslaught and had succumbed. Death, in his eyes, was natural. Immediately afterwards, the doctor would issue the death certificate. Although there are versions that disagree on the identity of the physician who issued it, the reality is that an official document attested to natural death from a non-traumatic cardiac arrest. A death without violence, without apparent external intervention, a peaceful departure in the solitude of her home. Nilda's body was transferred to a funeral home, where an austere, almost intimate funeral was held. A small group of people, the closest ones, gathered to share their sorrow. Among them, the figure of Giya Murano stood out, visibly affected by the loss. Her pain seemed genuine, her face contorted by grief. Nilda and Giya had shared a life. Countless tea afternoons, exciting casino visits, countless strolls through the city. Their closeness was such that their apartments, 21 and 20 respectively, were located next to each other on the same floor of the building at Mexico Street, 1177, in Montserrat. They were practically inseparable, their friendship a pillar in their lives. Nilda's death had struck Giya with devastating force. When other friends arrived at the funeral, hugs followed one another, and in each of them, Giya appeared distraught, an image of the deepest affliction. It was many years of a shared life, a story that now came to an abrupt and painful end. Nilda Adelina Gamba was buried in Chacarita Cemetery, and with her burial, it seemed that the chapter of her life and the tragedy of her death were closed forever. The matter, in everyone's eyes, seemed concluded. However, the plot of fatality was just beginning to weave. 9 days later, on February 19 of that same year, 1979, Mrs. Murano, with her face still marked by mourning, visited her friend Lara Formasano de Ayala, better known in her circle as La Chicha Formosano or simply Chicha Ayala. Chicha, a woman in the prime of her 50s, 51 or 52 to be precise, had been an inseparable companion of Giya for a considerable part of their lives. The encounter, amidst the shared pain for Nilda's recent loss, was met with a deep embrace, a gesture of mutual comfort between two afflicted souls. Giya, approximately 49 years old at the time, and Chicha had accumulated countless experiences together, a wealth of memories that only the most deeply rooted friendships can forge. They had traveled together to the famous Mar del Plata on innumerable occasions, exploring its beaches and charms. They were assiduous theater and cinema-goers, with at least a weekly date to enjoy some play or movie. And, of course, they used to meet with the deceased Nilda to share the ritual of tea and pastries, those high-end confectionery delicacies they so enjoyed. On this occasion, Giya Murano, or simply G, as she was affectionately known, had arrived at Chicha Ayala's house for a visit of condolence and comfort. Upon entering Chicha's house, the two friends sat in the living room, enveloped in the intimate atmosphere that only decades-long friendships can create. Giya had brought with her a box of those tasty pastries they both adored, a sweet offering in a bittersweet moment. Tea was served, conversations flowed, a balm for the grieving spirit. The afternoon passed between confidences, memories, and the comforting murmur of friendly voices. Upon saying goodbye, with the usual cheek kisses and promises to see each other soon, both agreed to a new meeting for later. Giya, with apparent spontaneity, revealed she had theater tickets and expressed her wish for Chicha to accompany her. It was an invitation that sealed a commitment for the evening, a plan that suggested the continuity of life despite the loss. These ladies of Buenos Aires society of the 70s, with their sweet and sometimes corny nicknames, cultivated a deep friendship, so intimate that it was known, in whispers, that Chicha had on more than one occasion covered up Giya's discreet infidelities. Giya, far from hiding her affairs, even boasted about them to her friends, and Chicha, with blind loyalty, had declared to be with her at times when Giya was engaged in other pursuits. Night fell over Buenos Aires, and punctual for the theater date, Giya Murano appeared at Chicha's home. She rang the doorbell, once, twice, 3 times, but there was no answer. She persisted in her calls, until the building doorman, a man attentive to the movements of his tenants, approached, offering his help. "Madam, at your service," he said. The doorman suggested knocking on the door more insistently, but Giya, with a gesture of apparent concern and delicacy, stopped him. "No, I'm not worried. She felt a little unwell this afternoon when I left her. Better to let her rest. What do you think?" "Never mind. I'll come back tomorrow." A perfect excuse, a plausible reason for Chicha's silence, and a justification for her own withdrawal. The seed of suspicion, disguised as compassion, had already been planted. The sun of the following morning illuminated a detail that did not escape the doorman. As every day, after picking up the newspaper, he diligently placed it at Chicha's apartment door. But that day, unusually, the newspaper remained untouched, uncollected, despite it being past 11 in the morning. Chicha, known for her punctuality and her fondness for morning reading, never left the newspaper unattended. The afternoon slipped by without any of the tenants of that building on Belgrano Avenue seeing Chicha leave her apartment. The doorman, who used to observe her leaving for her daily shopping or visits, did not register her in any of her usual outings. There were no signs of her. To prevent the newspaper from being damaged by possible rain in the hot Argentine summer of 1979, the doorman decided to pick it up, keep it, and incidentally, read it. The next morning, the routine repeated. The newspaper at the door, the wait, and the absence of a response. It was strange. The concierge, with growing uneasiness, put his ear to the apartment door. He could hear the faint murmur of the television being on. This sound, far from alarming him, instilled a false sense of tranquility. The lady simply did not wish to open. With that conviction, he continued with his daily activities. As evening fell, he passed by again, picked up the newspaper he kept for the night, and the silence in Chicha's apartment continued uninterrupted. Everything seemed to proceed with an anomalous normality. On the morning of the third consecutive day, the doorman, with an increasingly palpable premonition, again placed the newspaper at the door. By late afternoon of that hot, the 22nd of February 1979, the doorman's concern turned to anguish. The newspaper was still uncollected. But, in addition, a new element added to the uneasiness. The high ambient temperature amplified a strange smell. An unpleasant effluvium emanating from inside the apartment, mixing with the constant sound of the television. Another neighbor, noticing the doorman sniffing and making strange movements in front of the door, approached. He also perceived that peculiar smell, a nauseating fragrance that was annoying and disturbing. Shortly after, a third neighbor joined the group, confirming with a grimace of displeasure, "Indeed, it smells very bad. It smells like something rotten, something decomposed." Concern turned into alarm. Upon knocking on the door, no one answered. The doorman, possessing a master key, inserted it into the lock. But the door did not yield. An internal lock, a security chain, or a bolt prevented access from outside. The impossibility of opening the door, added to the fetid smell that intensified with each passing minute, raised the tension. By dusk, the stench was so unbearable that it became imperative to call the police. The arrival of the agents was quick and effective. They agilely slipped through one of the adjoining balconies, forced a window, and entered the apartment. Upon reaching the living room, the scene they found was gruesome. Mrs. Chicha Ayala lay seated in her favorite armchair, with the television still on, projecting senseless images in the stillness of death. Beside her, on a side table, a porcelain teapot, a cup with tea remains, and a basket with finely decorated pastries remained intact. A macabre tableau of an afternoon snack interrupted by the end. Her corpse, swollen and unrecognizable, was rapidly decomposing under the relentless heat of that summer of 1979. Putrefaction had advanced for 3 days, and the fetid and sweetish odors had taken over the environment, permeating everything. Immediately, the other pertinent authorities were alerted, who proceeded to remove the body and its immediate transfer to the legal medical service. There, the body would be thoroughly examined, seeking answers to this unexpected death. Meanwhile, Giya Murano, with a concern that seemed sincere, approached the scene. She asked insistently, here and there, but no one could offer her concrete answers. The forensic medical report, after a superficial examination, concluded that the woman had died from cardiac arrest. She had simply sat down to watch television and life had left her. The advanced state of decomposition of the corpse, aggravated by the summer heat, made a more precise determination difficult, but the forensic doctor estimated that death had occurred on the afternoon of February 19. No signs of external violence, blows, or wounds were found. The door was locked from the inside, the windows too, and there were no signs of forced entry or struggle. Everything seemed in order, a natural death with no apparent cause to justify a deeper investigation. Chicha Ayala's body, like that of her friend Nilda, was sent to Chacarita Cemetery, occupying lot number 30. In an extraordinarily short period of time, dear Giya Murano had had to attend 2 funerals of dear friends, visiting the same cemetery to bid farewell to the mortal remains of her companions. She was seen completely destroyed, undoubtedly, a soul struck by the cruelty of fate. Every time someone approached to offer condolences at the funeral, Giya would withdraw to one side, her dark glasses hiding her eyes, perhaps to wipe away tears that no one saw, while expressing with a choked voice her immense sadness and pain for such a loss. After this second funeral, an oppressive silence settled, a veil of mystery over these 2 sudden deaths. 2 elderly women, one with a compromised health history, the other apparently without health problems, Both lived alone, a reality that at that moment aroused nothing more than slight curiosity. Chicha had been widowed for some time, and her son had left to study in another city. She was a woman with a very comfortable economic position, owner of a fortune that, in that context, no one connected with her sudden departure. Days passed, February came to an end, and, without respite, another event occurred. The calendar marked the 24th of March 1979, and fatality struck again in Giya Murano's circle of friends. This time, the victim was Carmen Zulema del Giorgio de Venturini, whom everyone knew by the affectionate nickname La Mema. They were an inseparable circle of friends, a group of women who had shared the milestones and joys of a life in common. They watched their children grow up together, shared youthful adventures, vacationed on the same beaches, and enjoyed the same casino halls. Not a week went by that they didn't meet to lavish hugs, kisses, and the moi, moi ritual. And, of course, the ancient and sophisticated ritual of shopping could not be missed. The search for the most exclusive imported garment, the most dazzling jewel, the finest silk piece. Carmen Zulema del Giorgio was a woman of considerable fortune, a society lady whose life unfolded amidst luxuries and comforts. That afternoon, the peaceful quietness of Mema's building was interrupted by unusual movement. Neighbors and the doorman heard the sound of a door opening in a hurry, followed by stumbling steps that echoed on the landing. Then, a solid, dry thud, the unmistakable sound of a body falling heavily and rolling down the stairs. Panic seized everyone. Running desperately, they found Mrs. Zulema, La Mema, lying at the foot of the stairs, unconscious and in a deplorable state. It was evident that the woman was seriously injured, her life hanging by a thread. Without a moment to lose, the doorman frantically shouted for an ambulance, while another neighbor clamored for the presence of a doctor, if there was one in the building. At that precise and tragic moment, and as if fate were weaving a macabre mockery, Mrs. Giya de Murano arrived at the building to visit her friend. Besides being close friends, sisters of life who had grown up together, they were second cousins, a blood tie that reinforced their already close relationship. Giya found her there, lying inert. With a mixture of urgency and strange authority, she addressed the doorman. "Do you have the key to her apartment? Tell me." The man, still in shock, replied affirmatively. "Did she say anything to you before fainting?" Giya inquired insistently. The doorman shook his head. "No, I didn't speak to her." Giya then turned to the others. "But didn't she say anything to you? Did you say anything to her?" Faced with the general negative, the woman took the doorman's keys with unusual decision and, with inexplicable haste, headed back to Mema's apartment, announcing, "I will call her relatives right now. I'm going to look for her address book to call them." As Giya entered the apartment, the wail of the ambulance siren approached, growing louder and louder, until it finally stopped in front of the building. Doctors and paramedics descended with their equipment to assist the victim. At that instant, Mrs. Giya de Murano rushed out of the apartment, a notebook in her hand and, more relevantly, a small bottle. That's it, she exclaimed, with a voice that conveyed a mixture of relief and urgency. Without thinking twice, she got into the ambulance, ready to accompany her gravely injured cousin. No one questioned her presence. After all, she was the cousin, the only family member present at that moment of crisis. The ambulance sped through traffic, but before they could reach the hospital, Mema's life, Carmen Zulema del Giorgio de Venturini, was extinguished. Upon arrival at the medical institution, the body no longer responded. The woman was dead. They received the body and took it to the amphitheater, where uncertainty seized the doctors. What had happened? Mema, at 52 years old, was an active, strong woman with no known health problems. Her social life was intense, and her children visited her frequently. The perplexity was palpable. The on-duty doctor, after a superficial examination of the body, found no signs of foul play, no blows, wounds, or stabbings. The only visible injury was the one Mema herself had inflicted by falling down the stairs. Disconcerted, he left the room, only to be intercepted by Mrs. Murano, who, with a mixture of concern and strange insistence, asked him if he knew anything about the cause of Mema's death. The doctor, honestly, admitted his uncertainty. Giya then pressed, "Well, but what do you interpret? What do you think it could have been?" The doctor replied, "I don't know. We need to do some analyses. We need to examine her thoroughly." To which that woman responded, with suspicious alacrity, "Please, no. No autopsy for my cousin. It's not necessary." "Is it? She died of natural causes." This insinuation, so direct and premature, lit a red light in the doctor's mind. A woman in perfect health does not die like that without a clear cause. And Giya's vehemence to avoid an autopsy was deeply unsettling. His instinct screamed that something was not right. Breaking the usual protocol, the doctor ordered samples to be taken. Samples of blood fluids, tissue samples, and an exhaustive review of the body, despite the absence of a formal complaint to justify it. However, at that moment, no evident sign of poisoning or other violent cause was found. The lack of an explicit murder complaint led to the official declaration of the cause of death as natural of unknown origin. Mema's body was sent to the funeral, and once again, Giya Murano, in record time, had lost 3 of her closest friends. Giya had many friends, but these 3 were from her inner circle, confidantes and lifelong companions. Mema, in particular, was a woman of absolute trust. During the funeral, Giya appeared, once again, on the verge of fainting on several occasions, a spectacle of pain that shocked those present. However, after just a couple of days, things would take an unexpected turn. Diana, Mema's daughter, visited her mother's apartment and, with keen perception, noticed that something was not right. The place was slightly disheveled, and some valuable belongings were missing. Strangeness invaded her, and immediately she went down to interrogate the doorman. "Who entered my mother's apartment?" she asked, in a firm voice. The man, with a frankness that would soon reveal a crucial piece of the puzzle, replied, "The same day your mother fainted in the morning, her cousin, Mrs. Murano, had come." Diana, with slight disbelief, retorted, "And what's strange about that? Their family." But her mind was already weaving connections. The doorman continued, "When the lady fainted, coincidentally her cousin had just arrived to visit her. She asked me for the key and you gave it to her." The man nodded. "Yes, miss. I gave it to her so she could go in, because she was going to call the relatives." That detail, seemingly trivial, triggered an alarm in Diana's mind. No one in the family had received any call from Giya. It was she herself who, days later, had contacted the relatives, who learned of the tragedy through her. If Giya hadn't called anyone, why had she requested the key and entered her mother's apartment? The justification of calling the family crumbled. Diana returned to Mema's apartment, now with a new mission: to search. She knew of a detail that few knew. Her mother had lent a large sum of money to Giya for an investment, perhaps in some financial company or a similar business. And that money, 20 million pesos lei, a fortune for the time, had not yet been returned. Giya had signed a promissory note. Diana began to search for the mentioned promissory note everywhere, but did not find it. She went down again, and with renewed intensity inquired of the doorman, "Did you see if Mrs. Murano took anything from the apartment?" The doorman, after a moment's thought, replied, Yes, of course. She took the notebook, she took some things, and a small bottle with her mother's medicine to take to the hospital." "Which medicine?" Diana replied, her voice choked with surprise. The doorman described a small bottle that Giya was carrying in her hand, stating that it was Mrs. Mema's medicine that she had to take to the hospital. Diana's response was devastating. "But my mother didn't take any medicine, and much less from a bottle." The truth, like a lightning bolt, illuminated the dark plot. Immediately afterwards, Diana turned around, closed the apartment, and went to the police, where she filed a formal complaint directly accusing Giya Murano of having murdered her mother. Diana Formisano de Ayala's complaint acted as a catalyst, and immediately, the police began to tie up loose ends, connecting a series of events that, until then, had seemed like isolated tragedies. The three deceased women, Nilda, Chicha, and Mema, shared an undeniable common denominator. All three were intimate friends of Giya Murano. All three had died suddenly, without any immediate medical history that could justify such a sudden departure. On all three occasions, the last person who had visited them, the figure who loomed over their last moments of lucidity, had been Giya Murano. And on all occasions, Giya Murano had shared tea and the famous petite four pastries with them. The coincidence was too flagrant to be ignored. Immediately, the exhumation of the remains of the first two victims, Nilda Adelina Gamba and Chicha Ayala, was ordered. However, a month had already passed since their deaths. This temporal factor proved to be an insurmountable obstacle. Toxicological analyses were inconclusive for a simple and cruel reason. The natural process of cadaveric decomposition, as days pass, generates variants of cyanide, a series of chemical compounds containing this substance. Identifying cyanide poisoning in a body that had been exposed to the earth for a month, and therefore in an advanced state of decomposition and putrefaction, was a practically impossible task. Forensic science, at that time, faced its limits. But Mema's story was different, a window of opportunity. Her corpse had only been buried for 1 day. Upon being removed from the grave, with the urgency that the investigation demanded, an immediate and exhaustive analysis was carried out. The surprise was immense. Cyanide levels were found that could not be justified in any way by the process of cadaveric decomposition of such a recently deceased body. The conclusion was irrefutable. Carmen Zulema del Giorgio de Venturini had been poisoned. The truth, finally unearthed, triggered an immediate alert order. Justice, with its machinery now fully activated, proceeded to arrest Giya Murano. They found her, as expected, in her apartment, at number 20, at 1177 Mexico Street, in the Montserrat neighborhood. When the police knocked on her door, Giya, with astonishing serenity and an almost theatrical courtesy, opened and asked, "How can I help you?" The agents, without beating around the bush, informed her, "You are arrested for the murder of the three women, Nilda Gamba, Chicha Ayala, and Carmen Zulema del Giorgio." Giya's response was immediate, emphatic, and laden with artificial indignation. "But I didn't kill them." The police enumerated the charges, the evidence that had accumulated. Giya, with a blood-chilling calm, said, "Well, please, come in, sit down, and give me 5 minutes." With peculiar grace, she went into her room. There, with a meticulousness worthy of a diva before a grand premiere, she fixed her hair, put on some of her favorite jewels, donned an elegant sweater, a pretty pullover, we would say, and touched up her makeup. Finally, she came out with an enigmatic smile and declared, "Now, we can go." The authorities, with the murderer in their hands, would then begin a long and complex judicial process. Giya Murano was detained and, to the surprise of many who knew her connections, would remain in prison until 1982. During the trial, the prosecution presented compelling evidence of poisoning in Mema's case and the connections between the three cases. However, Giya's defense, skillful and astute, managed to significantly influence the judge's criteria. In that tumultuous year of 1982, Maria de las Mercedes Boya, Aponte de Murano, was exonerated and released. Apparently, the information obtained from the exhumed bodies of Nilda and Chicha, which proved inconclusive, was not enough to prove her participation in the first two crimes, nor to ensure, beyond all reasonable doubt, that she had been the killer in the third case. None of the witnesses could claim to have seen her administer the poison. Legalmente, Giya Murano era inocente. However, Despite the acquittal, doubts persisted, like a dense fog that refused to dissipate. The police officers in charge of the case, the prosecutor, society in general, did not agree with that verdict. It was a very strange historical moment for the Argentine nation, plunged into the depths of a military dictatorship that had begun in 1976 and would last until 1983. A convulsed country, where justice was often compromised by political influences and power. And Giya Murano, the exonerated woman, was, as would be discovered, a character of astonishing singularity, a society woman with a network of connections that made her untouchable. Giya Murano was none other than Maria de las Mercedes Boya Aponte de Murano. She was born in 1930 inches Corrientes, in northeastern Argentina. Her lineage was notable. Daughter of a military man who reached the rank of lieutenant colonel, and sister of another military man who, during the darkest period of the dictatorship, held the rank of general. She was not, therefore, an easy character to point the finger of accusation at, much less to condemn in a country under a military regime. Her social status and her family ties with the military power elite provided her with formidable protection, an armor against murder accusations. In addition to her connections, Giya Murano was an incredibly well-known and recognizable figure in social circles. After marrying Antonio Murano, a civil lawyer who, though respectable, did not enjoy a dazzling fortune, she had moved her residence to the vibrant Montserrat neighborhood, the heart of Buenos Aires, where offices, old mansions, and the commercial and cultural pulse of the city mingled. This young woman from the provinces, upon arriving in the capital, was dazzled by the whirlwind of Buenos Aires life, an existence she embraced with fervor. She had studied to be a normal school teacher, but she never set foot in a classroom as an educator, never taught a single class. Her true vocation, her irrepressible passion, was to be a public figure, the center of attention at any gathering. It's not that Giya Murano was a woman of classic or conventional beauty. She was tall, yes, with spectacular blonde or light-toned hair, which contrasted with her robust build and broad shoulders, a legacy of a youth dedicated to swimming. Her voice was thunderous, loud, unmistakable, and she loved social life, the bustle of gatherings, and being the center of all attention. Her husband, Antonio, used to lament, with a mixture of humor and resignation, that she had never cooked anything for him, except, perhaps, an occasional breakfast. Her thing, clearly, was not to tend to the home or anyone in particular. Her life revolved around going out for tea with her friends, embarking on long shopping sprees, and, of course, displaying her jewelry. It was said that Giya Murano was remembered more for the jingle of her bracelets and jewels than for the perfume she wore. She was a tremendous, imposing woman, with a presence that filled everything. She liked the good life, the glamour of parties, the excitement of theater and cinema, trips to exotic destinations, the adrenaline of the casino, and the bubbling pleasure of champagne. She always dressed in elegant, branded clothes, brought from Parisian boutiques, silks, and fine fabrics that accentuated her figure. The problem, as always, was money. All that sumptuous lifestyle required a fortune she did not possess. Being the wife of a civil lawyer, whose income was modest, the Murano family often found themselves in trouble paying the rent for their modest apartment. Giya aspired to be a true socialite, but she lived in a small apartment at 1177 Mexico Street in Montserrat, a building with some years behind it, far from the elegance she yearned for. Apartment number 20, where they resided, was small, cluttered with furniture, and certainly not the ideal setting for her aspirations. Therefore, she rarely received visitors at home. She preferred to accompany her friends to elegant restaurants or confectionaries in the area. On these occasions, it was not uncommon for her, when calling the waiter, to say with a complicit wink, "How wonderful! We are in luck. Today, we have Marlon Brando serving tea. How handsome!" But as soon as the young man turned around to fetch something, Giya would turn to her friends and whisper, with a contained laugh, "My God, he's the most horrible guy I've ever met in my life. Who brought him to work here?" Her ability for manipulation and deception was astonishing, an innate capacity to convince, to get what she wanted, to get away with it. She was also known for a peculiar detail of her personal life. Giya Murano liked men. Many, several, whoever they were. Her infidelity was an open secret. This rampant promiscuity reached such a point that her poor husband, Antonio, fed up with the deceptions, betrayals, and tricks, ended up asking her for a separation. However, in a convulsed and conservative Argentina as it was then, divorce was not a legally viable option. Antonio Murano, nevertheless, chose to abandon the apartment, fleeing a marriage that had become a farce. Giya, in addition to her appetite for social life and carnal pleasures, was a strict administrator of money, but only in the sense of spending it, not producing it. When Antonio, disillusioned and disheartened, began to lose interest in maintaining her extravagant expenses and limited himself to sending strictly what was necessary for the sustenance of Martine, the only child they had conceived, things began to get seriously complicated for Giya. She, impenitent, still wished to live the high life, the life she believed she deserved. She was a woman who attracted attention. Wherever she arrived, her heels were heard, her thunderous laugh, her voice when she called the waiter or spoke with her friends, a whirlwind of noise and presence. She was noisy, yes, but at the same time she was a compulsive mythomaniac, a master fabulist. She could shamelessly boast about the incalculable riches of her grandfather's hacienda, about the wonders she had known on her travels to the most exotic corners of the world, about the castle where she had stayed like a queen, about her friend and lover, an influential politician or a prominent military man, whose name she could not reveal, of course. All of this was a tangle of lies, woven with a skill that only true experts in deception possess. Certainly, she was a woman addicted to sex, but also, and perhaps more dangerously, addicted to lying, to deceiving, and she was magnificent at it. And do you know why? Because serial killers are, by nature, exceptional liars. It is an inherent quality of their psyche. Many of them usually project a facade of normality, naturalness, charm, but at the same time, they completely lack empathy. They can laugh with you, kiss you, hug you, show you affection, and then, without the slightest remorse, cut your throat and leave you to bleed out. This was reflected in the psychological profile that was drawn up of Giya Murano years later, in 1985. After the twilight of the military dictatorship and amidst a wave of trials and revisions of previous cases, a prosecutor, with unwavering determination, exclaimed, "Hey, this case is not solved, and this woman is free." He was referring, of course, to the notorious Giya Murano case. When the file was reopened in a renewed political and judicial context, new investigations revealed an inescapable truth. All the evidence, analyzed with a fresh perspective and without external pressures, pointed to Giya Murano having murdered her 3 friends by poisoning them with cyanide. The initial exoneration, in 1982, was due to the immense pressure exerted by her influential military relatives and, most likely, by the existence of some lover in a high position within the regime. But now, in a democratic regime and with a justice system less permeable to influences, the scenario was completely different. Giya was immediately arrested and sent back to prison. Subsequent investigations, deeper and less obstructed, led to a new trial. On this occasion, the truth prevailed. Giya Murano was sentenced to life imprisonment. Yes, she was found guilty of the 3 homicides, but the investigations also placed her under suspicion for at least 10 more crimes. The investigators who delved into her case realized that this woman possessed a particular psychological profile, a pattern that perfectly fit that of a multiple murderer. Her ability to deceive, her skill in inhibiting any hint of remorse or empathy towards her victims, made her a calculated and cold predator. It was discovered that Giya had had business relationships with the 3 women. To each of them, she had proposed spectacular investments, promising unimaginable profits from their savings. And they, trusting their friend and relative, handed over large sums of money. Of course, when the money, spent immoderately by Giya on her sumptuous lifestyle, ran out, the dividends stopped being paid. The women, seeing their savings vanish, began to request the return of their capital. Giya, harassed by debts and increasing pressure, began to visit them more frequently, seeking excuses, delaying payment, until finally, she opted for the most expeditious and brutal solution: to kill them. But Nilda, Chicha, and Mema were not the only potential victims. There were several open cases of very similar situations, sudden and mysterious deaths that had some link with Giya Murano. Unfortunately, the prosecution, with a deliberate legal strategy, could not correctly weave the evidence with all these additional cases. They preferred to concentrate on the three most solid homicides to ensure a firm conviction and avoid discrediting the main case with accusations that might be difficult to prove. For this reason, the other cases were not brought to trial. Although Giya Murano's shadow loomed over them, she was an exceptionally skilled woman at lying, at making herself liked, at camouflaging herself in any unknown environment and adapting to it with astonishing perfection. So much so that prison, that place of punishment and confinement, suited her as well as the high society she so yearned for. Once in jail, Giya began to relate, with astonishing ease, even with the most violent and dangerous prisoners, turning them into close friends, almost her loyal vassals. It reached the point that, on a good afternoon, she could be seen sitting at a table, painting the nails of a notorious murderer, and then sharing hugs, kisses, and a game of cards, as if they were three ladies of high society having tea. When any of the inmates was released, at the prison gate, it was common to find Giya Murano bidding her farewell with effusive hugs, kisses, and caresses, fixing her hair, giving her advice with a maternal air, only to then return inside and continue exercising her iron control over the inmate population. This woman was not just another inmate. She was the undisputed leader, a power in the shadows, capable of moving with disconcerting ease in such a hostile environment. It is estimated that at least 20 inmates were violently assaulted by other prisoners under Giya Murano's command and instigation. It was a fact little known publicly, but within the prison walls, her control was absolute, like that of any good psychopath, who exercises their dominance without the need for brute force, but through psychological manipulation. But if you thought that with the life sentence and prison control Giya Murano's story came to an end, you were deeply mistaken. The narrative of this woman, as fascinating as it is sinister, still had chapters to write. Giya Murano was released in 1995, under the protection of a new legal scheme that emerged with the advent of democracy in Argentina. Under the presidency of Carlos Saúl Menem, a kind of amnesty, or benefit for inmates, was implemented, popularly known as the 2-for-1 law. This regulation allowed people who had been in pretrial detention without a firm conviction, for a certain period, to appeal for an improvement in their sentence, in such a way that for each year of pre-trial detention served before the sentence, 2 years of served sentence were computed. Thus, a person who had spent 4 years in prison without a sentence was considered to have served 8. Under this scheme, Giya Murano's life sentence was commuted to 25 years in prison, which, applying the 2-for-1 law, was reduced to barely 16 years of effective sentence, and she served it. She was released in 1995. At the exit of the prison, a crowd of journalists, photographers, and television cameras awaited her. It had been the great criminal case of its time, the poisoner of Montserrat, and her release unleashed a media frenzy. At first, Giya refused to give interviews, covering her face with a gesture of false modesty. She demanded discretion, arguing that she had not been able to comb her hair or apply makeup properly, and that she was not wearing her jewels as she should, an eccentricity that bordered on the pathetic. But, incredibly, a short time later, The thirst for attention led her to grant interviews without shame. She became the fashion columnist for the program La Hoguera, was a recurring guest on Mirtha Legrand's program, where she narrated all kinds of adventures and misadventures, signed autographs, and, to the astonishment of many, became a socialite again. She moved in this new media environment with extraordinary skill. If someone wanted an interview, they first had to invite her to an opulent breakfast, and second, offer her something worthwhile. Money, some exquisite gift, or a piece of jewelry. Old age found her in 2014, when she passed away. In her last years, Giya Murano had developed a demential problem, a cloud that clouded her memory and left her absent, living in a nursing home after having been admitted by her family. Her legitimate husband, Antonio, had died in 1995, shortly after she was released from prison. But Giya's love life did not cease. Shortly after her release, she married a man who, upon realizing he had married the infamous Giya Murano, the murderer, immediately divorced her and gave an interview in which he claimed they had only spent the wedding night, and that afterwards he wanted nothing more to do with her. Even her own son, Martin, would write a book in which he would publicly declare that his mother was a terrible murderer and a series of other things, a painful filial denunciation. But the story, astonishingly, did not end there. Still later, Giya would marry again a blind man. This man, moved by her charm, offered her his apartment, treated her like a queen, and she, with her usual brazenness, declared to be delighted, that she adored him, that he was the ideal dream. Of course, she did not deny having other lovers, and spoke of her exploits with tremendous shamelessness. But the pattern would repeat once more. She was finally kicked out of the house when the adopted daughter of that man declared to the police that she suspected Giya was trying to poison her father after he fell ill from eating something she had prepared. It was then that Giya Murano was definitively admitted to a nursing home where she would live the rest of her days until her death, submerged in the fog of dementia. It is sad to think, but even in the final stretch of her life, she continued to fantasize with the same intrigues and manipulations. It is a unique case in criminal history, that of a murderer who, despite the evidence and conviction, was credited with the crimes, but whose denial was a constant until the end. She always denied it. Every time someone interviewed her, she would say with an impenetrable smile, "I didn't kill anyone." In court, her voice resonated with the same denial. "I didn't invite anyone to eat. I didn't poison anyone. I didn't kill anyone." However, during a memorable interview, Giya Murano, with an enigmatic smile and a penetrating gaze, would utter a phrase that would seal her legacy of mystery and ambiguity. "Killers are always liars." What do you think?
If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to give it a like, subscribe to the channel, leave your comment, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any future episodes. Your support helps us keep creating more content like this. See you in the next episode.